Välkommen till det första avsnittet av en podcast om den svenska narkotikapolitikens framtid. Mitt namn är Johan Svensson och jag är grundare av narkotikapolitik.se samt narkotikapolitik.online. Dagens avsnitt sker på engelska. Drug-related mortality remains a pressing public health concern, both globally and within Sweden, despite important key actions such as needle exchange programs and naloxone. Many individuals continue to face risks related to drug use, often caused by stigma and limited access to medical care. Harm reduction offers a pragmatic and humane approach to these challenges through measures such as opioid substitution therapy, what we in Sweden call LARO, and supervised consumption facilities. Harm reduction seeks to minimize the negative health, social, and legal consequences of drug use. These interventions are grounded in scientific evidence, public health principles, and a commitment to human rights. This is, might I say, a bit controversial in Sweden, as our official approach has been punitive, just say no to drugs, and the belief of a drug-free society, whatever that means. Today, we will examine the importance of harm reduction in the Swedish context and explore how this relates to international frameworks, such as within the United Nations. In the midst of all this, we find today's guest, Damon Barrett. Very welcome to Narkotikapolitik.
Thanks, Johan, and congratulations on starting your podcast. It's much needed.
Thank you very much. This is actually the first episode of 100, I hope. I actually look at your references for this episode, and they were quite staggering. You are the senior lecturer in human rights at the School of Global Studies and in the University of Gothenburg. You're focusing primarily on health and human rights. You're also the co-founder of the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy at the University of Essex. And you're also the formerly Deputy Director of Harm Reduction International, which you left in 2014 to move into academia. You have written and spoken internally about human rights and drug policy since 2007. And from 2016 to 19, you were a part of the core team drafting the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy. You're especially interested in the rights of the child, and your current research is about harm reduction for legal minors who inject drugs.
That's about right. Yeah,
that's about right. Damon, could you please tell us a bit about yourself? What are you up to today, except the research I just mentioned? You were born in Ireland, but you've been living in Sweden for how long?
Well, about 12 years, which is why I should apologize for speaking English today. My Swedish should be more fluent by now than it is, but I think if I'm going to speak on a topic as important as this, I need to be like 100% myself. What am I doing right now? I'm at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. But prior to that, I was at Sahlgrenska Academy, which is the medical and public health faculty there in the university. I'm still working mostly on drug policy and human rights issues, although I spend a lot more and more of my time teaching in human rights and public health, which I enjoy doing a lot. It's probably my favorite part of the job.
Didn't you win an award from your pupils a couple years ago?
Yeah, I started a course on health and human rights as part of our master's in public health, and the students nominated me for the Sahlgrenska Student Union Award, which is a teaching award called Pedalen, and I won that, and I was very, very pleased about that. So
great to hear.
Yeah, so right now I'm something called Utbildningsledare for the Masters in Human Rights at the School of Global Studies.
Yeah,
which I enjoy a lot. It's a really good program. It's great to meet the students, and we've a really cool teaching team there, international teaching team. Many of us struggling in the same way I do with Swedish, but we do our best.
What started your interest in harm reduction?
Accident.
Yeah.
I was working at Save the Children, rädda in the UK, and basically funding ran out for my position. I started as a fundraiser. I'm a kind of a failed ordinary everyday lawyer So I was doing a lot of work on what's called wills and probate. What do you do with people's property when they die? So one of my first jobs in a NGO was dealing with that for when people left money to the NGO in their will. And I got quite bored of doing that. So I started kind of sneaking my way into the child rights team and asking them if they needed any help. So I ended up working as a child rights researcher in Save the Children. And then there wasn't really funding to keep that going. And I saw a job at an organization then called the International Harm Reduction Association, which had just gotten a big grant that included human rights work, which was kind of unusual at the time. This is 2007, to have dedicated human rights funding in a harm reduction organization. Doesn't mean people didn't pay attention to human rights issues in harm reduction, but to get that kind of funding wasn't. So that's I got that job. I think on the back against stiff competition, on the back of the fact that I was a little bit outside of it, and I had a child rights background, and that was a bit new as well. So I got into it just because of that. It wasn't because when I started in harm reduction, I didn't know what it was.
I understand.
It's not exactly a self-explanatory phrase. My first thinking was, those safety plastic things you put on the corner of cupboards to stop the children banging their heads. I thought it was maybe that,
Invented by IKEA somewhere.
Something like that. I was like, what is this thing? It turns out I'm not a million miles away. You could ban the design of that cupboard, or you can make it safer. But once I got into it, it captures you because it's, I think, endlessly interesting. There's an amazing crowd of researchers, practitioners, and activists out there. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of, for good and bad, changes. And it just keeps you involved.
How we as a people approach dangers within our society.
Yeah, how we approach risk and harm is a lot about what harm reduction is about. But also beyond that, how we treat people. There's a lot of really detailed analyses in there. It can sound very technical about the specific harms of a particular substance. And often we talk in terms of bloodborne viruses, and we talk in terms of overdose mortality, and of course we should. But beyond that, there's really interesting socioeconomic issues to talk about, and there's international and national and local dimensions to this. Sweden's a good example of that. In the Sweden's involvement in the international stage, but also just the variation in approaches and attitudes within Sweden. It's super interesting once you get to that level.
So what is harm reduction? Why would it save lives in Sweden?
I think it already is saving lives in Sweden. So harm reduction kind of famously for a long time doesn't have one agreed definition. And for some people that is considered a negative. I think it's just kind of natural that something as potentially broad as this. So harm reduction, in general though, harm reduction is about aiming to reduce the negative health and social consequences of drug use without necessarily requiring that people stop using drugs. The word necessarily is doing a lot of work there. The idea is that, of course, if somebody wants to be abstinent from drugs, they should be supported to do it. The thing that harm reduction adds is that right for you right now? Is that what you want? There's a principle of meeting people where they are. Where are you right now with your drug use? Whether that's going from, I'm going to a festival and I'm going to try ecstasy for the first time, to I've had a serious background of trauma and I've been injecting drugs for 20 years. It's like, okay, we've got all these relationships for drugs, all of these potential areas for intervention. The first one of those doesn't need treatment of any sort. The person is not dependent on anything. But there's an intervention there to keep them safer, potentially. Whilst on the other end of the scale, there's somebody who might say, right now, I'm not ready to do treatment, but I'd really like to be tested for hepatitis and see if there's treatment available for that. I'd like to get more stable housing, even if I'm not ready to come off the drugs yet. There's all sorts of ways of doing things. So this idea of meeting people where they are is really key.
But does that mean that harm reduction is only an appropriate approach when you have started using drugs, or can you work with preventive measures within the harm reduction ideology or mindset?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So there's a sometimes what you see is harm reduction listed third after prevention. So prevention, treatment, harm reduction, as if it's a kind of a fallback. And I think that's incorrect. Prevention is a set of interventions, and treatment is a set of interventions. Harm reduction is an orientation, a theory for what you're going to do about drugs, which can affect how we look at prevention and how we look at treatment, and also how we look at particular interventions. So there is some really good work being done around a harm reduction or a more harm reduction oriented approach to school-based prevention. There's been some trials done of this method, which is now based at Stanford University. It's a really innovative method, which starts with the principle that the safest way, if you're a young person, the safest way to protect yourself from drugs is don't start, right? I don't think anybody wants to say anything otherwise to young people who are going to school. But at the same time, it recognizes the reality in which those kids are living. Some of them have witnessed overdoses. Some of them see drugs paraphernalia where they live. Some of them are going to parties and they're witnessing and they're experiencing and they're being offered and all of this. So at the same time, it's like, okay, well, I can't just tell you to not do these things. But I'm also concerned that you, let's say, have the knowledge that if you do go to some event and something bad happens, you know what to do.
Yeah, exactly.
But also the safety to come to us if you're curious or if you're not sure. And these kinds of things matter a great deal. So I think there's some really good work going on there. And prevention work as well has always recognized that there's a scale of prevention. There's sometimes what's called universal prevention, which is broad messaging, don't do drugs. That's, I think, widely known to be pretty ineffective. But it leads all the way down to something you might call indicated prevention, which is when drug use has already started and you don't want it to get worse, or you don't want someone to get harmed by it. I think there was already a good connection with a harm reduction mindset already there. Sometimes these things cross over quite well. We just don't always call them the same thing. So no, it's not just if people have already begun using it, but it's mostly focused there.
Yeah. So what does it mean to adopt a human rights approach to the use of drugs within, for example, harm reduction?
Yeah, well, this is a really big question. So it's actually when I said I was hired at that organization, which is now known as Harm Reduction International. It was then the International Harm Reduction Association. We just thought that was too much of a mouthful. It was part of our job at the time to really explore what the connection between human rights and harm reduction, what those connections were. We focused a lot on the human right to health. I think the best way to think about it, though, is not specific rights, but more something called the human rights-based approach, which was developed within development work. There's a statement of common understanding within the UN on this. The idea is from these various human rights documents and these various, whether it's the Universal Declaration on Human Rights or whether it's the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what are the kind of the principles that would underpin work that foregrounds those rights? And if we take those principles and we look at harm reduction through that lens, it becomes quite interesting. So one of them is trying to advance human rights itself, such that the realization of human rights is one of your goals or your main goal. So if the realization of the right to health is one of our goals, then we look at the availability and accessibility of harm reduction services as part of a right to health approach. And that's been a pretty good line of thinking and argument along the way. Because accessibility can relate to things like financial accessibility, and harm reduction has always been promoted as a free at the point of delivery thing. But then we also look at things about not just the advancement of human rights as a goal, but what human rights as part of our method or part of the means to get there. So that includes non-discrimination as an aim, who we include, who we don't include, and that kind of thing. That's also an outcome. It includes meaningful participation, which is a key issue. It's been exceptionally difficult for people who use drugs to have a voice sometimes including in harm reduction services. That this isn't always a sales pitch for harm reduction services. It's also a way to critically reflect on how we're doing things. The many examples around the world of harm reduction services that don't properly listen or maybe aren't run in the most respectful ways they could be. So the human rights-based approach is also a way of critically reflecting on that ourselves.
I think it's quite an easy mistake to make, looking at harm reduction as a single procedure, as I said, single measure, instead of like a totally new mindset, how we relate to people who use drugs, how we minimize damage.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, about a human rights-based approach, I don't want to say something too obvious, I hope, but the human rights is grounded on a very fundamental idea, which is the inherent dignity of every human person, right? Now, if you take that forward, people don't lose their dignity because they're using drugs. There is an attitude, however, and this is something that I think is quite dangerous, where we do think that there's something about having drug dependency where you are not living a dignified life and it's my job to restore your dignity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a recipe for coercion. I think what we have to do, on the other hand, is recognize that people have that inherent dignity, which should include the right to speak for themselves. And if that's difficult for some people, then we have the obligation and the duty back to help them to voice what they would like to happen for themselves. And I think too often in too many countries, the idea is I'm going to impose my will upon you because my vision of your good life is different from yours.
That is very interesting, because right now we see in Sweden a debate which was presented by the NGO Narkotikapolitik Center, NPC, in Sweden, where they argumented that within preventive measures, you can still talk about human rights. But as long as you start talking about like legalization or decriminalization of the use of narcotics or drugs, you can't really like combine those with an approach to human rights.
Okay, I mean, I've not read the report, but I'll take the argument you put forward on face value. Let me just say, I think I can wholly reject it. It depends on how holistic you want to look at the drug supply chain. One of the reasons to legally control the drugs market is because of the scale of the violence of it. It's not just that people are harmed by drug use, people are harmed by drug production and drug trafficking. And our responses to production and trafficking can themselves, and often do, cause gross human rights violations. Now, some would say, okay, don't violate human rights in your efforts to control drugs. I agree, we can do that immediately. Governments don't tend to, though. On the other hand, if the entire drug market is controlled by criminal gangs, then there's going to be necessarily a currency of violence around that, which is going to affect people. And governments don't get to pass off their human rights duties just because the market has been criminalized. They don't get to say, therefore, the consequent violence or the consequent hindrance to development is not our fault anymore because it's a criminal market.
Yeah.
Well, criminalizing something and keeping that market is a political choice to be made and does have human rights consequences. I tend to think that we'd be better off with a legally regulated market, even though I think there's a huge amount of complications to that. And we can look at decriminalization then as well. And look, the deterrent effect of criminalization is very weak, I should say, in terms of its evidence. But if someone wants to demonstrate the criminalization reduces overall use of drugs, they can try that. At the same time, they need to take the other side of that argument, which is what kind of social and interpersonal damage does a criminal record do for somebody? Often what we get is people saying, well, look, people aren't being imprisoned just because of their personal use of drugs. Okay, fair enough. In some places, trust me, they are. But let's say here in Sweden, but still we have to deal with criminal records. Now, there might be a lot of concern, let's say, for children's well-being. Well, okay, what benefit is it to a child of a parent who's had a criminal record or 2 or 3 due to their drug use? which will necessarily and on purpose damage that person's ability to get into the labor market.
Yeah.
Criminal records are designed to hurt people. They're a punishment. And I think we should talk about them like that. So does hurting people because of their drug use, someone could do it, people need to own their own policy suggestions. I tend to think it doesn't have the deterrent effect that people think it has. I don't think the evidence holds that up. At the other hand, it does have a damaging effect on the people who receive them. It adds to social stigma on top of that. And I think it keeps us in a narrative about drugs that is overall damaging to the people we're supposed to care about.
Yeah, but does that mean that we of course have drug harms, but do we have something that is we could maybe describe as drug policy harms?
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Yep.
one of the kind of central tenets, I would say, of harm reduction thinking, and that's both research and advocacy, is separating those two things out.
Yeah.
Because there is no doubt that there are drug harms. There are harms associated with using most drugs. If you're injecting, there's risks and harms associated with that. The drug policy harm is, are those risks and harms made better or worse by our policy choices, including the whole spectrum of the supply chain? Is the content of the material you're using or the substance you're using better known or less known? Is clean injecting equipment available? Are you going to make choices around your behaviors due to the fact that you're afraid of the police? There are all sorts of ways that the environment, or what some people call the risk environment in which drug use takes place, is affected by both macro and micro level policies, economics, physical factors, and social factors, and we need to pay attention to all of those. So the policy is a big part of that, and it includes local policies, national and international. If we've learned anything from social epidemiology, is that we can't reduce health harms, for example, to individual behaviors. Individual behaviors are part of it, but it's taking place in a policy environment that can structure those behaviors.
I think you're touching a kind of a hot potato within the drug debate. That
I think the whole debate's a hot potato.
Oh yeah,
that doesn't bother me.
Of course, but that we actually have something that could be described as drug policy harm. Because when I've been talking, like having debates with other people, they are like, yeah, of course, the Swedish drug policy isn't perfect. We can do better, but it still needs to be, for example, criminalized. So in one way, they acknowledge that there are some harm connected to the criminalization of the use of drugs. But I think very few people are ready to describe what those harms should be, other than like being mentioned as a criminal and growing up as a kid, having tried drugs. And
well, all countries have drug policy harms. They just have different forms of them. I mean, the most extreme drug policy harm would be just killing people in the streets. Drug policy harm has been the environmental destruction in parts of Latin America. These are drug policy harms. And I think drug policy harms, too, are laws and policies and political rhetoric that create an environment in which people who do use drugs, and especially people who've got problems with their drug use, are pushed to the margins of society. And I've used those words carefully because that's from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime from 17 years ago, that one of the consequences of the approach we've taken globally is pushing people who use drugs to the margins of society, which isn't a good outcome, especially when the whole thing was set up to protect those people. So there's something contradictory there in our concern about drug harms and the policy choices that were made to respond to them.
I think a reflecting argument could be that if we start like hugging the drug users and allowing them to use drugs, as in saying that it's okay to use drugs, that would increase the harm of drugs within the society and also increase the number of users. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's if you're relaying the argument accurately, it sounds like a mix of a straw man and fanciful thinking. Harm reduction's been around for a really long time in relation to, let's just say injecting heroin. Let's use that as an example. What we don't see is the existence of harm reduction programs, so say a needle exchange, and young people wandering by and saying, "Oh, that looks like a good idea. I think I'll get into that." The harm reduction message is this can be dangerous. But we have responsibilities as policymakers and, let's say, practitioners to intervene there, because we can't moralize our way out of this. So when it has been evaluated, this was a big question around the opening of North America's first safe injection facility. Sometimes now these are called overdose prevention sites because of one of the big things they do, which is stop people dying. One of the big questions when it was being approved was, will this somehow encourage drug use? So that was part of the evaluation process, and it didn't seem to. It doesn't mean that other regulatory choices, say if we went down the route of aggressively marketing cannabis as something you want, in the way that, say, in the early 20th century, tobacco was aggressively marketed, right? If we went down that route, that's probably not a good idea. Yeah. We already know this from tobacco. We already know it from alcohol, which is why we aim to restrict advertising, which are policy harm issues.
Yeah.
So I think we need to watch out. Look, you certainly don't want to overcorrect. You don't want to move into some arena where you're saying, look, I see all these harms from prohibition. Therefore, the best thing to do is to gift this to unaccountable corporations. This is also not a direction that a harm reductionist would want to go in.
Yeah.
And have been very vocal against since legalization debates really kind of gained speed.
Mm. The Swedish political party Vänsterpartiet proposed a motion last year about testing and evaluating the use of drug consumption rooms in Sweden, or what we call brukarrum or konsumtionsrum. The motion was, however, denied, as it was considered impossible to combine with our current drug criminalization. What are your thoughts about that? Do we need to reform the way that we legally look at drugs?
The question, yes, is the answer to that. We do need to look at the way we legally regulate drugs. But in relation to drug consumption rooms, or as I said, more and more referred to as overdose prevention sites now, one of the real benefits there is that if somebody's using on site and something bad happens, it can be responded to. This is one of the clear pieces of evidence. If you're in the middle of, as they are in North America and some other countries, of a real crisis of overdose, then these centers will save lives. There's no question about it. They'll also reduce bloodborne viruses. And on top of that, if run well, and they're really good connections to social services and they're centers where you can do other work. Now, in terms of the criminal law, it probably is the case that under Sweden's current legislative framework, one of these would be very difficult to set up. But, even with the opening of needle exchange in Sweden, or let's say, legalizing needle exchange properly, back as long ago as 2006, there are legal tensions to be dealt with there anyway. There's a kind of a blind eye to be turned to the fact that everybody attending a needle exchange is officially at some point committing an offense in terms of being under the influence of drugs, eget bruk, or they may well possess drugs when they're there. So if a police officer wanted to A, undermine that service, and B, pick up a lot of arrests, hanging around at a needle exchange and arresting everyone going in and out would probably be a choice you could make. It would be a terrible choice, and the police don't do it. Why? Because they recognize that's got a public health and an individual medical goal to deliver for those people going, and they're doing very well, by the way, the needle exchanges in Sweden. which have expanded, and this is a good thing, of course.
I think all the regions in Sweden now.
I think all regions have them, and you know, that's also excellent. And even then, there's geographical access problems for people. There's all sorts of issues with it in that they're all basically at medical centers, and some people are quite anxious about going to those things. So there's people not being reached, but more people are being reached, and they're doing well. And I've met some of the people involved, and they're all really dedicated and doing wonderful work. It's not easy stuff, what they're doing. No, but coming back to the legal challenges, this was an issue in Canada when the first safe injection facility was opened in Vancouver. This is going back now 25 years. One of the issues was, is it 20? Yeah, it's about 25 years, maybe even more. One of the issues was, well, possessing drugs is a criminal offense. So that service was granted an exemption under Canadian law. That was an available exemption at the time for research purposes to possess these controlled substances. So the idea was that if people were possessing drugs on site, they were on-site exempt. And then beyond that, the police, the site had the support of the police that they said, we're not going to interrupt what you're doing here. We've got a serious problem of drug-related harm. And when we find somebody ejecting in the alleys, we're going to direct them towards you guys. So there was you absolutely need the police involved. And I think a lot of police would be very supportive as well, because they're meeting people who use drugs more often, if not most, for good and bad reasons.
Yeah.
Right? I'd say, but so there are definitely legal tensions, but I don't agree with the idea that we can't do something because of those legal tensions. Laws can be changed. They get changed all the time. They get amended, introduced. The needle exchange law in Sweden has been amended to make improvements. It's not an argument against doing something that could save lives, I don't think. The tougher argument for me would be, where would you trial such a thing? Where is there a sufficient kind of potential client base for it? Sweden's a bit different from some other countries. If you go to central Copenhagen or central Oslo, where they've drug consumption rooms, there's a very visible open drug scene.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't have a very similar kind of thing, at least not as far as I've witnessed. Maybe a bit more in some places than others. That's not to say that it couldn't be beneficial. I'm just saying your choice is about where you would trial such a thing.
Yeah, how do we find them?
Yeah, how would you, and also, I think Sweden still has some way to go to build up trust with certain people. I've been interviewing people who began injecting drugs when they were under 18, and one of the key issues coming across was their experiences with social services and healthcare over time, and their schools when they were there, has made them quite distrustful of the system. And trust is a difficult thing to build up.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting you talk about people who started using drugs when they were under 18. What can you tell us about child-centered harm reduction?
Oh, well, child-centered harm reduction was a phrase that myself and some colleagues have been trying to introduce, knowing that throwing the word child next to harm reduction would be controversial for some. But the intention was actually as something of a critique of harm reduction itself. Harm reduction is, you can take the example we've been using quite a lot, which is injecting. Your average client at a Swedish needle exchange is going to be in their mid to late 30s, right? Yeah. There's going to be much older people, and a lot of the services are designed around their needs. Fair enough. That's most of your clients. Here in Sweden, you're very unlikely to encounter somebody who's, let's say, 16 injecting drugs. Even though our research shows that 29% of people who inject drugs in Sweden began before they were 18. So there's this little wind. Now we think it might be going down. I mean, the amount of people beginning before 18 might be going down, meaning the mean age when you begin is going up, which is probably a good thing. But there's a little window there, because what we found is the people who began before they were 18 have all sorts of increased harms later on, despite all of the compulsory measures that were imposed, or used, I should say, is fairer, when they were under 18.
And maybe harm reduction shoots too wide and needs to be segmented?
Yeah, so the child-centered thing is trying to just trying to challenge the harm reduction field to think more carefully about, we've been getting better at talking about youth harm reduction. The problem with youth is that is a really broad term. It's a very useful term in certain ways, in the same way that adolescent is a useful term in certain ways. And but child is, in my head, because from the child rights background, is somebody under 18. And I also use the phrase legal minor to draw attention to the fact that somebody's not a legal adult. So they've, lesser opportunities and ability to make choices for themselves. This is really, really challenging stuff because the harm reduction field, in my view, hasn't been strong enough at looking at children's issues. Now, it has been in certain areas. It's been very strong, especially I would say in North America, looking at questions of parents who use drugs and the relationship between parents and social services, because there's been some very coercive measures made against pregnant women and against actually often women who are parents. And there's been quite a lot of work on harm reduction approaches to that, but less around young people themselves who are under 18 using drugs and what a harm reduction approach has to say about that. So the child-centered harm reduction was us trying to push the harm reduction field to explore that more carefully and in a way with a phrase like that could bring us all together. Now there's, like I said, there's tensions. Some people don't like to use the word child because it conjures in the mind a 3-year-old. When, if you're talking about certain forms of drug use, you're more likely in your, mid to late teens. But nonetheless, that's at the very, you got young people who are vaping, right? They're going to be 12 years old, right? You got young people who are using cannabis, drinking, all of these things. We can have harm reduction conversations about these, but our anticipation and our hope is that the harm reduction conversation differs for children than it does for adults. It has to. So one of the things we explored with this, for example, this is why we focused on injecting, even though it's much rarer than other forms of drug use among this age group, much, much rarer. At least in the high-income countries we've been looking at, we talk about harm reduction services as being, quote, low threshold. And that's much more difficult and maybe not as desirable if somebody's, say, 16 versus somebody being 24, 25. In that, for example, here in Sweden, under 18s can't go to needle exchanges here, or at least they can't exchange needles. They could turn up, but they can't be helped in that one way. One of the reasons for that is actually quite a good reason, which is that the staff would necessarily have to report them to social services, which damages a principle that they're operating under, which is no coercion. That's well thought through, but it has an effect for anyone who might turn up at that age. And we have seen in some of the, when we interviewed some of these people who began before they're 18, that was their biggest worry.
So how do you find children under 18 who inject drugs?
Very, very difficult. We interviewed people who were adults who began before they were 18. So some of them were talking about experiences 10 years ago, right? Which carries its own limitations and difficulties. But interestingly, I talked to one young man. It was 3 countries. I won't say which country he was from, but he was only 19 and he'd been injecting for 2 years. His experiences didn't differ much from somebody who was recounting their experiences from 10 or 12 years ago. So it was kind of interesting that way. We also spoke in our research to practitioners, so street-based outreach workers, youth substance abuse treatment people, harm reduction people, and so on. And reaching the young people who are currently under 18 and say involved in injecting drug use, because this is, again, we're not talking, this is going to be much less common than cannabis and smoke and all the other forms of drug use we could think about. But one of the challenges was you've got these centralized services where if you're a young person looking in, what you see is lots of predominantly older men hanging around, and you don't identify it with it. Some of the young women we spoke to didn't feel safe going there. And that's that thing about not being designed. Whereas people we spoke to in Wales, some of the professionals said, if you go back 15 years, they used to have more of a kind of an outreach-based approach. Rather than expecting people to come to them, it was much more about going out, and they felt that their ability to talk to people was better that way. We've had people approach us as part of our research. He said, I'll do an interview, but only on Signal or some other way, because I'm so socially anxious. I live my life online. I'm ordering all my stuff online. I can talk to you about that, but I honestly can't.
Yeah.
So reaching somebody like that's going to be very, very hard. Like, and if you really wanted to reach every single person, hugely expensive and probably impossible. But the question would be, is there a way to make things more available, more accessible to those people who might need them? Now, the answer to that is what that would look like, I don't know. But one of the things people talk about elsewhere is, can we help people who work in other kind of youth services be a little bit more informed about harm reduction, a little bit more informed about these drugs issues, so that if that's a point of contact, that they kind of have more knowledge and more skills about what to do, rather than saying we've this one harm reduction place over there where they mostly service people that you don't identify with.
Yeah.
But we've already got a relationship. Can I talk to you about your drug use?
So we need like a child-centered drug policy?
I certainly a child-centered drug policy that is much better at talking about children than just saying kids shouldn't do drugs. Everybody knows that. And while of itself it's not in any way a bad statement, it can lead us to making decisions about all other aspects of drug policy, which from my mind is not actually taking a child-centered drug policy. It's using children to justify what you already wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I'm not a fan of that happening. So kids should not do drugs. Everybody knows that. I've got 2 kids, right? Everybody knows this. That's one aspect of it. On the other hand, I don't want kids living in neighborhoods that are more violent than they need to be.
Yeah.
I don't want kids who are living in a small holding in rural Colombia having their small holding sprayed because of an American policy. I don't want kids having to do trainings on how to avoid gunfire in Mexico because of some drug policy choices we've made, right? We have to think a bit more carefully about this. Here in Sweden, we can certainly have a child-centered, but then it doesn't have to be as dramatic as some of that stuff I was talking about. Let's look at, okay, do our social workers have enough training on what to do about drugs questions? Is there enough communication between the youth substance use treatment, the Maria clinics that we have that do excellent work? Is there enough communication between them and social services? It's not all the really hot button topics, right?
Yeah.
There's real progress to be made in the structure that's there, but I don't think that should give us an excuse to not talk about those bigger structures either.
So as a word parent who thinks that their child might be using drugs, injecting drugs, smoking drugs, instead of just keeping it down to like taking a drug test, that's yes or no. You want to expand how a parent reaches out to their kid who they suspect uses drugs?
I'm very skeptical of that kind of drug testing. I do want to say I've been talking a lot about injecting because our entry point was harm reduction, and it's kind of like this apex harm reduction question. When we're talking about kids and young people, this is going to be a very, very unusual conversation we have. I think it needs to be had because I'm researching it and I hope it's important enough to research. And in other countries, you got serious issues with injecting among people who are that age. But in terms of, we're going to be talking much more about alcohol.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about vaping, smoking, cannabis, pills, right? But all of that has harm reduction messaging around it as well, right? Solvent use, gas inhaling, right? We've got all sorts of things to talk about, and it's going to be more common than that. So I wanted to make that super clear. I'm not lumping all drug use into one method of intake. But now you have to remind me what the question was.
As a parent who has a child, instead of just relying on a drug test, can I as a parent expand how I approach my kid if I suspect that they use drugs, using like a child-centered harm reduction approach?
That's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't want to in any way kind of tell parents what to do. Some parents are really at the end of their rope, right? And the last thing as a harm reductionist you want to do is start judging people for these kinds of choices. All I would say about drug testing is that you might find out for sure. I'm not even sure if I'm skeptical of some of the testing kits that are available, but nonetheless, let's say you can find out for sure. I think you just have to think about the costs of doing it as well. In that you want to have some kind of a conversation with your child, some kind of a trusting relationship. Now look, in certain circumstances, that relationship might have broken down, in which case, why would that teenager be doing your test for you anyway? But I think promoting it to parents it seems to me to be somewhat misguided. And at worst, potentially even preying on parents who are struggling like that.
Yeah.
I would lean more towards people who are experts in family counseling than a testing kit.
Yeah.
I don't know what that's going to do for you long term with your relationship with the young person or their relationship with drugs.
So I think we have time for one last question for the day. Might even have two. What do Swedish decision makers need to better understand regarding the international guidelines on human rights and drug policies?
Oh, okay. That's a nice question, given that I was one of the team drafting those. So I need to explain what those are. So the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy were a response to the question you asked at the start, is what does a human rights-based approach even mean? Well, till that date, nobody had, because it's such a big project, nobody had come together and said, right, well, how do human rights standards apply to the whole spectrum of drug policy from production all the way through to use? So it took us 3 years with funding from the Swiss and German governments and from the UN Development Programme and consultations all over the world. I think maybe overall something like 200 people fed in somehow. Expert peer review from human rights lawyers, from the UN system, from experts outside of that. And what you have then is a set of standards that says, here's the most up-to-date application of human rights to drug policy. And that, it involved us making some pretty difficult decisions. We had to be true to international law. So we couldn't just pretend that we don't have UN treaties about drugs. What we did was we showed that there might be tensions between parts of those treaties and parts of human rights law, but we didn't say human rights law says you must go and legalize drugs.
Yeah.
We didn't even say human rights law requires that you go and decriminalize possession or personal growing of a few plants of cannabis or something, because currently it doesn't. What we did say is that human rights law draws attention to the harms that those measures can do, and that within the UN drugs treaties, you may decriminalize drugs. You're permitted to do so. You can't legalize because those treaties stand in the way of that, but you can decriminalize. And that if you take a human rights-based approach, you probably should. But we couldn't. So it's pretty conservative in that way, more conservative than some of our experts that took part wanted us to be. So what I would like Swedish policymakers to do is read them, see what's actually there. There's also a very lengthy legal commentary backing up all of the principles. And, when they're read, some governments are taking them very seriously. Those guidelines are embedded in Colombia's drug strategy for the next 10 years on the basis that Colombia knows that the way that they've been addressing the drugs question for all of these decades, pushed in many ways by the United States, has been deeply harmful. And they want to take a completely different view on what they're going to do about coca growing, what they're going to do about harms related to drugs in their cities and elsewhere. And they're really trying to reorient themselves, and they've used the human rights-based approach as a way to do that. So what I would say to Swedish policymakers is, and I say this to students in public health and human rights as well, is don't fool yourself into always thinking you're the good guy just because you've got a good goal. Having a drug-free Sweden might sound like a good goal, but how you get there might cause damage. And as a policymaker, you got to take responsibility for that damage. And coming back to a human rights-based approach, one of the key principles is accountability. You got to the so-called duty bearers have to take responsibility for the human rights consequences of their choices. and show how they're actually living up to human rights. So if a Swedish drug policy is going to say it's in line with human rights somehow, I think it needs to demonstrate how. And the guidelines can be used to do that. And in some ways, it will be. I think Sweden has done a good job recently of improving the right to health through the expansion of naloxone and the expansion of needle and syringe programs, right? So that's a measure for the good. It's not going to be all bad, right? But there might be one or two things that get found that policymakers are comfortable enough doing something about. And I think that's probably a really good starting point.
We're on our way.
I think so. I think Sweden's moving in a good direction and has been for quite some time. And I think and I'm sure your podcast will, when you speak to people working on the front lines, a lot of people have a pretty clear harm reduction orientation these days. And maybe if we went back 20 years, they didn't, or fewer people did. I think and I think that's across from social work to healthcare to the police. And that's a good thing. And I think that comes from a hard-won experience from those people. Big challenge we've got, of course, we're taking a human rights-based approach, is we still need to make the voices of people who use drugs much more heard. It's a very difficult thing to do. People work very hard on trying to do it. But it needs really clear support and funding for that to be available. And I think it's a key issue, because meeting people where they are can't be done unless you listen to them. And that, I think, applies at the policy level as much as at the individual healthcare level or social care level. So what do we do around a behavior among people you know better than we do? It's a pretty obvious thing to go out and ask.
Great. So, Damon, thank you for participating in the first episode of Narkotikapolitik.
Congratulations on having a first episode of Narkotikapolitik.
Thank you very much. I hope we see you maybe soon again in the future.
Yeah, come back to me when you've spoken to somebody who knows better than I do, or somebody who challenges something I said, and I can either retract it or defend it.
I promise. Maybe even a podcast debate.
Yeah, I'm sometimes not a big fan of debate formats, but let's say a podcast discussion we can have.
Great. Thank you very much, Damon Barrett. I hope you have a very nice vacation, and I hope to see you soon again.
You too.